When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I'm your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, Richard Lim's This American President, and more. You can go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more about each of these shows and new shows that could be coming anytime. Patreon is a great way to support the history of the papacy and keep this project going. And you can find out more information at patreon.com/history of the papacy. We have 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome, each of which represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. Your biggest benefit is that you will be commemorated on the History of the Papacy Diptychs, which in traditional Christianity is the list of bishops and in order of their precedence. So you want to sign up early to Patreon so that your name is higher on the lists. And there's also monthly book drawings, early content, ad-free content, and bonus episodes, just to name a few. So definitely, I highly suggest you go and check us out at patreon.com/history of the papacy. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level. Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople level. And reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. In today's episode, Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow will dive into the intellectual tradition of early Christianity. We will talk about who some of the important Irish Christian intellectuals were, how they operated, and how they spread their version of Christian scholarship, not only through Ireland and Britain, but throughout the entirety of continental Europe. With that, here's the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. If we move on to what were some of the big cities that were starting to, as we get into the later Middle Ages and we're getting some new things. We have the Vikings coming in. How does that continue to develop?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. So if we're looking at kind of pre-Viking Age Ireland, there aren't really any cities that we would think of today. They tend to be, smaller settlements. And again, that's going to be a little bit different to what we expect to see, from places that were part of the Roman Empire, where Rome, founded these, Londinium, Eboracum kind of places. But then when the Vikings come in, they start to found what becomes cities. And some of the big ones that I can think of just off the top of my head are, Dublin is a big one. We've got Waterford, Wexford, Cork, Limerick. These are all places that are going to have a close Viking Age, Scandinavian connection, because that's where they decided to settle when they decided that raiding wasn't just going to cut it anymore. They wanted to start spending the winter over in Ireland and then, settling permanently.
How did those cities develop a Christian and an ecclesiastical support and a system?
Yeah, so we see the Vikings kind of getting pulled into Irish politics fairly quickly, and, being able to talk a bit more in depth about that would be, I think, really interesting. But just to give a little blurb about it, if you like, their finding themselves in a context in which, we're looking more and more at society itself being Christian. And so if they want to trade with people, it's likely they're trading with Christians. If they want to take wives from the local population, they're likely to be Christians. If they're wanting to, make agreements with local kings to serve as mercenaries in their wars against other Irish kings, it's likely that those kings are going to be Christian. So they're going to get a lot of exposure. And as they start to get that, we're going to get the ecclesiastics coming in, or maybe there's a monastery nearby. Anyway, near Cork, there's Lismore and a number of other monasteries. So they're going to be around. And I think that's probably, I almost want to say by attrition, kind of how they start to get pulled into Christianity. Talking about the Christianization of, Scandinavians, I think is really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, because they come in, and in different ways, different places where the Scandinavians went, sometimes they had their families with them. But if you're going into a place that's heavily acculturated in one area and you want to become a part of that culture, it's really a lot easier to just become a part of that culture than to really impose your culture on top of that. It's just not how that would generally work. If you're a handful of Vikings going into England or Ireland, you're not going to necessarily, and you want to get married and you want to settle down, you're still probably going to carry on some of your aspects of your culture just naturally, but it's a lot easier to learn their language, get into their religion so that you can get married, settle down, do that whole thing.
Yeah. And we start to see, once we've got the kind of Viking kingdom of Dublin getting fairly large, we start to see Vikings who themselves have Gaelic names. And so it's very obvious that there's been intermarriages going on between, Scandinavian and native Irish or Gaelic speaking peoples. And we might have a think about the degree to which a certain amount of interreligious, experiences within a marriage were going to be fairly normal, even though we are moving increasingly towards a very Christian society.
Yeah, I think of it's something that it seems so real to me that it plays out. Like you maybe have a Viking who comes in who's into Odin or whatever. He's marrying a Christian, and maybe he adopts Christianity in every way, but he's still going to just naturally carry on with some of the things that he always celebrated. And it's going to get, folded in a little bit, at least into his Christianity, or a lot of it, probably depending on case by case.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories that talks to the conversion of Scandinavians is, more in Byzantium, and they would do these big baptism events. And this one guy comes in and he gets his baptism, and they give him, a new piece of clothing, and they're giving new clothing to all of the people getting baptized. And we're told that he turns to the people who are doing the baptizing. He says, well, this shirt isn't as nice as the one I got last time. And so that's kind of evidence for us of, how sincere are some of these Vikings actually being, when they go through some of these mass baptisms. They're going, I'm going to get maybe a nice meal. I got to wash myself anyway. Maybe it's Lagerdag, maybe it's washing day. They're going to give me some stuff afterwards. In their own religion, they're not beholden to just a single deity. They can, revere any deity they want, basically. And so they're like, right, I'll worship your guy too. You're going to give me some nice stuff. So we can throw that into the mix. And I think that goes back to when we talked last time about the conversion of Ireland and what the thought process of some of these kings, or even just your everyday person, might bring to the process of conversion, or the sincerity of their conversion.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We're really looking at, in any cultural change, what's the really zoomed out view, but all of these changes were really made granularly. They're changed at, the individual pixels come together to make the big picture.
Yeah.
We talked in previous episodes about the Druids and the intellectual life of Ireland. How did that evolve throughout this period?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, yeah, we talked previously about this intellectual class that existed from really the ancient period, as early as we have texts talking about the Celts, these Druids, these bards, these vates, and that carries through to a degree into the Christian period, even into this 17th century. Even you've got these hereditary positions of poets and bards and historians. I've mentioned the court poets that existed in Wales and what's called the Old North. So we can see that kind of following through. But we also have an intellectual class that's ripe and I think ready to just cross over into this Christian intellectual position. And we see that a lot with these monasteries that themselves become these centers of learning. And we're told that a lot of people would go to Ireland to receive religious training in Christianity, even once it becomes Christian. So we are seeing this big intellectual tradition. And I'll plug again my favorite monastery here. Bangor Monastery was well known as being a very intellectual site. So it's really easy for these religious intellectuals to just move over to similar positions in Christianity. And that's the people that we can look to who wrote a lot of the literature that survives today from medieval Ireland. So I know I've already mentioned that there are records in the annals that refer to celestial or astronomical phenomena, some of which we can test for accuracy. And the number of entries and the general accuracy of those entries has led some scholars to suggest that there was a sustained and powerful observation of astronomical phenomena being carried out in Ireland from at least the 7th century AD. And that comes from Ludlow in the interpretation of celestial and environmental phenomena. And we can kind of compare that against what the Roman authors are saying about how the Druids themselves were natural philosophers and they made great observations of the stars. So we can almost see to a degree the transition of this intellectual class from a pre-Christian to a Christian society. Adovnan himself of Iona was a prolific writer. In addition to writing the life of St. Columba, he wrote De Locis Sanctis, or On the Holy Places, about different places sacred to Christianity, although he didn't go there himself. And he promulgated a law known variously as Cain Adovnan, the law of Adovnan, or Lex Innocenti, the law of the innocents, in 697 AD. So we can kind of see, the development of what we'd consider a complex society and continuing through into the Christian period. So this law of the innocents was built off of an earlier law of Patrick, or Cain Patrick, that the law of Patrick protected only monks, but the law of Adovnan extended to women and children as well, to kind of protect them in terms of, fighting and battles. And it brought the church more directly into the situation when these people were injured or damaged, and it would levy additional fines on the perpetrators that would then be paid to the church. And we've talked in previous episodes about these honor prices that were assigned to people through this secular legal system that either decided what fines you had to pay or what degree of care you had to give. There were some, if you injured someone of high status and they didn't die, but they were injured, they couldn't work, you would have to provide someone to do their work for them. And it also stipulated the quality of food you were required to give them. And so that all goes into the legal system, but the church is now bringing itself into play for this to say, well, no, not only do you have to pay either that person or that person's family, but now you have to pay the church as well. So they're bringing themselves into that. And then to get back to Bangor Monastery, it's been associated with a few different styles of literature. One is Bulashivna, which is about a king who goes mad. And if any of your listeners have watched any of Neil Gaiman's American Gods, they would recognize the character Mad Sweeney as coming from this story. And so that's a little point that you can kind of draw our relationship with medieval Ireland through up to present day. And an extremely valuable early book that I've already mentioned, The Antiphonary of Bangor, was likely completed at Bangor itself. So we can see this, high degree of intellectualism. And, Bangor was associated with Computus, which was the calculation of Easter. And there's a manuscript, I think it's in Switzerland at the Stadtbibliothek, that even says Silan Makumend, who was an abbot of Bangor, was the first to learn the Computus by heart. So we've got this, information going as far as back to the continent to, talk about the intellectual pursuits and attainments, I'd say, of, the Irish intellectual religious class.
And now a word from our sponsors.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World
I
off.
praise the
K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Hello, I'm David Jeremiah. As America celebrates 250 years, we would do well to remember that the strength of a nation is found not only in what it builds, but in what it remembers. And the greatest thing America must never forget is God. We have been blessed in remarkable ways, and those blessings should lead us not to pride, but to gratitude, not to self-confidence, but to humble dependence upon the Lord. This is a time to renew our commitment to truth, faith, and character, and to pray that God in His mercy and grace would continue to guide and bless the United States of America.
And related to the intellectual development in Ireland, Ireland also had a distinctive art style. How did that develop in the Christian era?
Yeah, so I think the art that comes out of the medieval period is just phenomenal. So Celtic art, if we start kind of in this ancient period, is first this Hallstatt, which is this more geometric type. And then we get into the Latin, which is that curvilinear type. And then we start to develop towards what we'd recognize on the Book of Kells, this kind of interlace that comes in. And that interlace comes in from the Saxon influence. So what we might think of this Celtic knotwork that's almost ubiquitous in our minds as something that's Celtic is itself a development of the medieval period through interactions with other nearby cultures. But anyone who's seen even a picture of the Book of Kells, and one of their carpet pages is where they've got just the full page is just covered with illumination and all these really detailed, really intricate designs. And I think you can see the full Book of Kells online now. And so I'll make sure you've got the link to that so you can provide it for people, because it's amazing. And you can zoom in really close and see just the level of detail they're giving into their spirals. So we've got this manuscript illumination tradition, and that tradition is itself affected by the metalwork tradition. I think a great piece to have a look at, and you can find this online through the Museum of Ireland, is the Ardagh chalice. And it's this phenomenally detailed, metal chalice that was made for religious purposes. And you can see similar metalwork styles being used in the manuscript illumination, but then also on the crosses that are made and erected. So we end up with these magnificent high crosses. And, many of your listeners who know anything about Ireland will likely be familiar with the high crosses, especially from the 8th into the 10th centuries is really when they're at their height. And some of them are incredibly tall and really fantastic. And again, we can see this similar style from this metalwork coming through in how the sculptures themselves are designed. And we get some difference in this sculpture between what we see in Ireland, or we might think of as Gaelic Scotland, is the high crosses where you've got the cross itself carved out of stone. And so you've got the thin base, and then it widens where the arms are, and then back to the thin top with the circle that makes it that Celtic cross we're familiar with. And then in Pickland, which would be kind of north and east of Scotland, north of the Firth of Forth, if you're trying to picture that in your mind, that's kind of the area most associated with Pickland. They tend to have cross slabs. So these are going to be big rectangular slabs of stone that have crosses carved onto them, along with other ornamentation, or a lot of times hunting scenes or scenes of battle that are put onto these cross slabs. And so that's a little difference in artistic style that we can see even just in that sculptural method.
We talked about intellectual pursuits and art, and those are really associated with high status. What are some of the high status sites that we can look toward?
Yeah, so I've already mentioned Armagh, Kildare. Kells is another big one, since that's one of the places of the Book of Kells is thought to have been written. We're not really sure where exactly it was written, but Kells was closely associated with Iona. There's also Clonmacnoise, which is founded in the mid 6th century, and the annals of Clonmacnoise come from there. We've got Inishfallen, which is there in the south of Ireland as well, and the annals of Inishfallen there. We've got Glendalough, which I think is fantastic. I've been fortunate to go and visit there, and so the name there translates as Valley of the Two Lakes, and it was founded in the 6th century by Saint Kevin, and it became itself quite a large site, and settlement kind of grew up around it, and it had workshops for processing vellum and a scriptorium. And I like to kind of bring up as much as I can this, having a scriptorium and processing vellum and being able to make these manuscripts is itself indicative of the high status and the wealth of a monastery, just because of how much effort and resources and time has to go into processing the vellum, having all of the calves that are required, and then, being able to, get the materials you need for the ink, and have people who are capable and trained in, even if it's just a copyist, like you have to be trained. There's not much space for you to mess up on one of these leaves that you're writing. So the existence of a scriptorium, I think, is very indicative, especially along with these high crosses or these cross slabs, as indicators of high status sites. And then I wanted to just kind of tack on to the end Mellifont Abbey and Cashel, both of which kind of get going in the 12th century, but Cashel becomes this really big religious power center in the south, and is another really fantastic place to visit. It's called the Rock of Cashel because it's up on this uplift. It's really nice. And then in Dalriada, which is this kind of Western Gaelic-speaking part of Scotland, we've got Iona, and then we've also got Lismore, which is an island. If you know where Oban is in terms of Scotland's geography, it's an island off the coast of Oban. It's about an hour by ferry, very small ferry to get across to it. But MacLeod is another saint close to my heart. And then if we go up a bit into Pickland, you've got Rosemarkie, Port Mahomet, then you get Dunkeld and St. Andrews, in Strathclyde, which should be a British kingdom, so they'd be speaking a Brittonic language, which I like to poke a bit at people and call it kind of a Proto-Welsh, is Glasgow. So here where I live would have been part of this British or British-speaking kingdom. And there's actually, Glasgow itself has a cathedral, so it's quite well known for that, but less known is in Govan, where there are some really impressive carved stones. And there was a elite secular site just across the river at Partick. And so we had even, close to home for me anyway, some important high status religious sites. And then down in Galloway, of course, we've got Whithorn and St. Ninian kind of rounding out some of these places. And then I'll give just a quick, the bishoprics in Scotland in 1200 were in Caithness, Ross, Moray, Aberdeen, Brechin, Dunkeld, Argyll, Dunblane, and Galloway.
And it's like you were saying, that these places, once they started to produce something high status like the vellum, it required so many different activities. They all started to, I guess, to use a modern terms, they're getting economies of scale there, and they're starting to have value add. And that's even probably drawing even more. If you're going to set up more high status things, you can start doing them all together in these areas, which is just making them richer and richer.
Yeah. And then we might consider, to what degree are those all sustainable? Maybe someone is losing patronage from an important secular elite, and that's, causing then a decline. Some of these sites aren't well known so much these days, and even Port Mahomet has evidence of a wide-scale burning of the site that occurred, even while it was kind of at its heyday. Some of the carved cross slabs that existed, were still pretty fresh and new when the burning occurred, and then they were literally broken up and, with sledgehammers basically, and strewn across the site, and it was repurposed to be a place of trade. And the evidence doesn't show that it was someone else coming in and destroying the site, and it was before the Vikings really had got around. So it must have been Pictish peoples themselves going, right, well, we're done with this monastery thing. We're just going to repurpose this into a trade and craftwork area. So we'll just knock all this down, just remodel. We're gonna do something else now.
And now a word from our sponsors.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center may not be available in all states, not available in California.
Now, moving on, we get into that these Irish intellectuals and Irish church people, they really hit above their weight, you might say, in that they have so much influence throughout the rest of Europe. And how did that happen? And where were some of their centers where Irish went to the continent and into other parts of Europe and really made a huge impact?
Yeah, they really did. And as far as why it started to happen that way, I think that's a great question to have a think about. And I don't have a firm, absolute answer for it. You know, we might have a think about, you know, if Ireland was outside of the Roman Empire and had its own ability to kind of continue on, it didn't have to recover from the loss of Rome, if you like, the way other places might have had to. That might go into our thoughts about why. But yeah, they got all over the place, really. The best known one I've also already mentioned is Columbanus. So he founded monasteries in present-day France at Annegray, Luxeuil, and Fontaines before he headed off to modern Italy at Bobbio, where he founded his final monastery. And again, this is where his life was written. Other locations include in Switzerland at St. Gall, and I think I've already mentioned that the earliest surviving manuscript of the life of St. Columba is located at the Stadtbibliothek in Schaffhausen, Switzerland. And that manuscript is believed to have been written before, I think it's 719 AD, and Adamnan himself only died about 705. So this is, you know, amazingly close to the author himself. We almost never get manuscripts that are, you know, their provenance is so close to the time that they were first written. We also see sites in Germany and Würzburg. You know, that's where that piece of paper was inserted into a manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew, and then they've just got this bit of paper stuck in going, oh, Mosenu Macumen, you know, it specifically says Scriba, an abbot of Bangor, having learned the Computus by heart. So we know that this reputation for some of these intellectuals is coming back to the continent along with their Irish compatriots. In Milan, we've got they're known as the Milan glosses. So it's glosses that are in Irish. So you've got your Latin manuscript, and the Milan glosses are specifically a commentary on the Psalter. And so basically it's the equivalent of when you've got your textbook and you're studying and you're going to write your notes in the margin to help you better understand what the text itself is. That's what these glosses are. So it's someone who speaks, you know, this is probably Middle Irish or by this point. So someone who speaks Middle Irish is living in Milan and reading this Latin commentary and writing notes for themselves or maybe for future people in the margins or in between the lines to help them better understand the material, with the expectation that either themselves or the future people know Irish well enough for that to be helpful for them. And I think that, you know, that itself is an excellent example of just how many Irish people got back onto the continent, that, you know, you can see existence of them around. They're called the Scots or the Scotti, which is a reference itself to, you know, being a Gael or being Irish.
It opens up so many different things to think about it. You think about somebody we talked about earlier, Pelagius, who lived in the 400s, early 400s. It was pretty easy for him. I mean, relatively easy for him to go from Britain to North Africa to the Middle East. But now we're talking 100-ish or so years later with somebody like Columbanus. He's living in a completely different world where going to northern modern day France, that's a huge trip with a lot of dangers. And the fact that people like this were able to bop around so many places throughout Europe, did they write about that, any of the difficulties in travel that they had to make to get to these different places?
I know there's some mention of travel. So in the life of St. Malachy, he goes from Bangor through Scotland, down through England, and then goes across to the continent, stops at Clairvaux to hang out with Bernard for a while before making his way down to Rome and then going back home. So he actually makes this trip twice in his life, and he ends up dying at Clairvaux on the second trip. So I think that is some interesting evidence, and we can't assume that every single saint who there's a mention of him going to Rome in his life, we can't always assume that that's true. But, there are people who did do it. And, making that trip, once or twice in your life, Malachy himself ended up becoming papal legate in Ireland. So we know that he did his trip. But yeah, I think that it kind of shows that although travel was different than it had been, say, during the height of the Roman Empire, it still was something that was feasible.
With these different scholars, were they being recruited, so to speak, from Ireland to go to the continent, or were they going of their own? That maybe there was just, you might say, a glut of intellectuals in Ireland, and they're going to find their fortune, so to speak, for lack of a better word, trying to find more opportunities. Was it kind of a push or a pull for them?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of push and pull factors. So you have this idea, I know you've talked about martyrs and martyrdom before on the podcast. So there wasn't really a lot of opportunity for your traditional martyrdom, shall we say, in Ireland. So they came up with different forms of martyrdom. And one of those forms was to either leave the place of your birth. So you'd leave your own kin group and go somewhere else in Ireland. And that was considered to be, a kind of form of martyrdom. And we've talked previously about how important your position in society and how that exists relative the people around you is. So it is a big deal to have completely left your natal context. But then there's also this version of it where you leave Ireland completely, and the idea is you never return permanently. So we can look at St. Columba as having done this, even though we know from time to time he did go back for visits to Ireland, but he never went back to live there. And Columbanus is doing something very similar. So there's these kind of penitentials, maybe we could say, but they're doing this specifically, as a form of, seeking a greater degree of exclusion from what they know or what they've known. And so I think we see a lot of that in people who choose to leave Ireland, but I think also, especially because of their reputation for their intellectual achievements, that rulers are going to want them to come to their places as well.
To put a wrapping on today's episode, which will really lead into our final wrap up of all of this, how does this idea of Ireland being out of conformity with Rome come from?
Yeah, so we've touched a little bit on this already today, but I think it's likely partially to do with what's known generally as the Easter controversy, which was a dispute involving the calculation of Easter, and which we're planning to cover in the next installment. So in addition to that being a dispute about Easter, there was also a dispute about the proper method of tonsure, which differed between the continent and the Gaelic world. And then on top of that, we've got this 12th century influx of Cistercian reform into Britain and Ireland. And it seems likely that this renewal of interest in classical learning of that time caused a return to the classical view of periphery as barbarian, which we've already mentioned a bit today. And Ireland had long been viewed as peripheral. Even during its Christian period, they were calling it like the ends of the earth. And Patrick, you may recall, talked about how he'd gone beyond the point at which anyone lived. And so this could be where the view that Ireland, was in urgent need of reform kind of got its steam. And so, we've got that Cistercian reform also happening around the same time as this English colonization of Ireland. And so the work of Gerald of Wales also comes in here to talk about the backwardsness of the Irish and why it was so necessary for England to come in and take control. So I think those, things taken together, I think, have a lot to do with this idea of Ireland, being kind of not together with the small o orthodoxy of the rest of the Christian world.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center may not be available in all states, not available in California.